Hi, and thank you so much for popping by. My name is Bita Pobalozi. Feel free to call me Bui. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about one of my other favorite YouTubers, and her name is Nozi Kamgana Mayaba. Nozi, I am so sorry if I said that surname wrong because, ma'am, you're Thanks to Nozi, I did a little quick look at what the data says about HIV related travel restrictions. In 2021, New Zealand became one of the countries that removed restrictions for people living with HIV. So, with the removal of New Zealand's restrictions, UNAIDS counts 46 countries, territories, and areas that continue to impose some form of restriction on the entry, stay, and residence of people living with HIV based on their HIV status. So I'm going to look at the global regions in terms of which regions allow for travel for people living with HIV, right? And which regions have travel restrictions for people living with HIV. So in North America, for entry and short-term stays, there are generally no restrictions for people living with HIV traveling to North America. In the US, people entering with prescription medication, including HIV medication, need to carry a doctor's certificate in English stating that the drugs are required to treat a personal condition. In Canada, you have to take an HIV test if you plan to stay for more than 6 months. All long-term visitors are assessed in terms of how much excessive demand they might put on the Canadian Health Service. A cost of more than 24,057 Canadian dollars a year is considered excessive, but the cost of many publicly funded HIV medications is less than this amount. Now, in Central and South America, for entry and short-term stays, there are generally no restrictions for people living with HIV traveling to Central and South America. There are restrictions on long-term stays in Honduras, Nicaragua, and Paraguay. In Paraguay, for example, those traveling to the country because they want to apply for permanent residency have to take an HIV test. A residence permit won't be granted if the test is positive unless you can pay for your treatment yourself. For Aruba, Belize, Nicaragua, and Suriname, the regulations are unclear or inconclusive, so you would have to contact the respective embassies for guidance before you travel. In the Caribbean region, for entry and short-term stays, there are generally no restrictions for people living with HIV traveling to the Caribbean. Cuba, the Dominican Republic, St. Vincent, Grenadines, Turks, Caicos, and the Virgin Islands all have restrictions on long-term stays. For example, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, work permits are not renewed in the case of a positive HIV test result, and HIV positive foreigners have no access to treatment and services. In the Cayman Islands, St. Kitts, Nevis, and St. Vincent's, regulations are unclear or inconclusive. So no information is available for Bermuda. You have to contact the respective embassies for guidance before traveling. In sub-Saharan Africa, which is currently the region most affected by HIV globally, there are generally few restrictions for people living with HIV traveling to sub-Saharan Africa. However, in Equatorial Guinea, you may have to present an HIV test certificate. If you are HIV positive, you might be refused entry or deported. The following countries have restrictions on long-term stays: Equatorial Guinea, Mauritius, Seychelles, and Sudan. And then regulations are unclear or inconclusive in Angola, as there is no information available for Sao Tome and Principe. So in the case of Angola, you would have to contact their respective embassies for guidance before traveling. In North Africa and the Middle East, most of the countries that restrict entry based on HIV status are in North Africa and the Middle East. Living with HIV may mean you are not allowed to enter Jordan, Iran, Iraq, the United Arab Emirates, or Yemen, even for a short stay. However, there are no restrictions if you are passing through Dubai in transit as an airline passenger. Countries with restrictions or potential restrictions on long-term stays include Algeria, Bahrain, Egypt, Israel, Kuwait, Lebanon, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Tunisia. Almost all these countries will also deport people based on their HIV status. Note that regulations are unclear or inconclusive in Iran, Qatar, and Tunisia. Therefore, you are advised to contact their respective embassies for guidance before traveling. In Western, Northern, and Southern Europe, for entry and short-term stays, there are generally no restrictions for people living with HIV traveling to Western, Northern, or Southern Europe. In Cyprus, people from outside the EU who are applying for a temporary residence permit have to prove they don't have HIV before a permit will be issued. However, this rule doesn't apply to diplomatic personnel and high-ranking company employees. In Central and Eastern Europe, in Russia, no testing is required for short-term tourist stays up to 3 months, but foreign residents found to be HIV positive are expelled. You are required to present a negative HIV test result for a stay longer than 3 months, or if we are using a multi-entry visa. In Bosnia, Azerbaijan, there are restrictions on long-term stays. And in Slovakia, people from outside the EU applying for a temporary residence permit have to prove they don't have HIV before one is issued. In Hungary, you have to report your HIV status when applying for a residence permit. However, being HIV positive can't be used as a reason for denying your permit application. In Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan all have restrictions on long-term visits, but the rules are unclear or inconclusive, so you would have to contact their respective embassies for guidance before traveling. In East Asia, for entry and short-term stays, there are generally no restrictions for people living with HIV traveling to East Asia. China used to ban short-term visitors with HIV, but it doesn't anymore. An HIV test is required, though, for work and study visa applications of more than 6 months. The only country in East Asia that deports people because of their HIV status is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or North Korea. So North Korea in this particular East Asian region is the only country where you will be deported if you are living with HIV. In South and Southeast Asia, there are generally few restrictions on entry and short-term stays for people living with HIV traveling to South and Southeast Asia. However, people living with HIV are not allowed to enter Brunei, and people who are found to be HIV positive can be deported in Bhutan. You have to present the results of an HIV test that was taken in the 6 months before your visit if you want to stay longer than 2 weeks. People who test positive may be deported. In the Maldives, Malaysia, and Singapore, there are restrictions on longer term stays. The regulations in Malaysia and Sri Lanka are unclear or inconclusive, so you would have to pass by your respective embassies before you travel for guidance. Oceania, is that a region? In Oceania, for entry and short-term stays, there are generally no restrictions for people living with HIV traveling to Oceania. The exceptions to this are the Solomon Islands, where entry may be denied on the basis of HIV status, and the Marshall Islands, where HIV testing is required for temporary visitors staying more than 30 days. In Australia, all long-term visa applications over the age of 15 have to take an HIV test. For those under 15, an HIV test might also be carried out if you have a history of blood transfusions, your mother is living with HIV, or there is a medical sign that you might be living with HIV. So long-term visa applicants who have long-term health condition, including HIV, are considered according to how much they might cost the Australian health system. Information on this can be found on the Australian government's website. In New Zealand, as we've just seen, since 2021, they have removed some of the travel restrictions. So in New Zealand, people with HIV are assessed on a case-by-case basis. If you are living with HIV and in a long-term stable relationship with a New Zealand citizen, you'll be granted an automatic medical waiver. This means that your HIV status isn't considered as part of your application for a visa or residency permit. And even in the case of PrEP medication, in case you're taking PrEP, the AIDS Map website says we are not aware of any countries that ban people who are traveling with pre-exposure prophylaxis, right? However, most countries limit the amount of prescription medication you can travel with. Usually you'll be able to take enough medication for about 2 to 3 months stay, but should always check the rules for the countries you are traveling to and from, as some have stricter rules. And it's usually a good idea to bring your prescription with you. Essentially, the advice here, which is really coming out, is that before you travel, if you happen to be a person living with HIV, before you travel to any country, just make sure that you check up on these embassies, check up on the data online to see what are the current restrictions, what are the laws when it comes to traveling as somebody who's living with HIV. But luckily, it looks like there has been a lot of progression, right? There's been a lot of progression. So the numbers of countries that still have some of these restrictions are now counting at, with the removal of New Zealand's restrictions, countries, there are now 46 countries, territories, and areas that continue to impose some form of restriction on the entry, the stay, or the residence of people living with HIV based on their HIV status. So thank you, Nozi. I thought that was a very interesting conversation you raised, and I think this would be very useful information for anybody who is living with HIV and thinking about traveling somewhere for a holiday. Just make sure that you check out some of this data so that you don't find yourself in precarious situations. Alrighty, my friend, thank you so much for popping by. I hope you're having a lovely day where you are, but most importantly, I hope you're having a healthy day wherever you're watching me from. Bye.